Hello, everybody. It's Wine with Dr. Wendy once again. I've got my glass of wine. I hope you have yours because we are going to talk about a very exciting, I think exciting, and not talked about enough topic. We're going to talk about boys and sexuality. Well, hopefully not young boys, hopefully adolescents and older, but how parents and schools and educators can start to begin to open up that conversation. And I have two preeminent experts in the field. First of all, from Ithaca, New York, Dr. Rebecca Plante. Hi, Dr. Plante, how are you?
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm so happy to have you. You've written so many books, including the textbooks on the subject, but the most recent book you've written is Sexualities in Context. Thanks for being here. Also, one of my favorites, Dr. Andrew Smiler, author of Challenging Casanova from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, my intrepid producer, Laura Hampikian from Boise, Idaho. And I'm Dr. Wendy Welsh from Los Angeles, California. Thanks for joining us here on our Google Hangouts. I always say Helpouts because that's a whole different Google product. All right, Dr. Plante, I want to start with you. What kinds of messaging are boys getting? What kind of education do most boys get about love, dating, and sexuality?
Well, in general, even though things have changed a lot across U.S. culture and North American culture, we don't really do a good job of talking to young men and to boys about sexuality. The conversation is mostly absent. My students will talk about how the only thing they ever heard about sex was some parent, if the student was heterosexual, some parent would be saying, "Don't get anybody pregnant," and that parent maybe was dad in that kind of tone of voice, you know, don't get anyone pregnant, and that would be the whole conversation. Or, "Do you have any condoms?" Good, and that's the whole entire conversation.
Wow, that's so limited for such a very complicated topic. And Dr. Smiler, what I love about your book, where you challenge this whole mythology that every boy is destined to be a Casanova or a Don Juan or a player, is that you finally start to talk about the big taboo subject. I call it the big F word, feelings. And how would you, what do you say to young boys or parents of boys and how they can talk about the emotional aspects of those kinds of relationships?
Well, and thank you for the praise there. One of the things that I encourage the boys I work with, the parents that I'm seeing, is to encourage boys to talk about their feelings. What makes them happy? Why do they get excited seeing this person instead of this person? And also, what do they get nervous about? What makes them sad? Because we know that boys get dumped. We know that boys get turned down for first dates. But we don't often ask them about that. So just trying to give the boys some basic vocabulary, even those kind of simpler feeling words, and some space to acknowledge those kinds of feelings.
And when you say, why do you get more excited about this person or that person, the answers that come from the guys aren't necessarily about physical excitement, are they?
No, that's an excellent question. There is certainly a piece of physicality in there. Certainly some guys are much more interested in bodies than other guys, but they often talk about, she's so nice, or he's so funny, or I don't know, we just really get along, and it's like magic when we talk. And they'll go off on that for minutes at a time, but we often don't think to ask boys those questions because we've taught ourselves, we've convinced ourselves in the U.S. that boys don't have feelings, men don't have feelings. So we don't even think to ask the question a lot of times.
And actually, your book talks about how this idea of the player as the big goal in our culture is really a big bunch of mythology. Really, how many players do exist in our culture?
It depends a little bit on how you define it. When we look at some of the data from the public health world, where they've for a long time tracked pregnancy rates and also disease rates, and therefore risk for unintended pregnancy, risk for sexually transmitted infection. I just went through a series of studies and looked for data on guys who say they've had 3 partners or more in the last 12 months. That's one new partner in 4 months. In any given year, somewhere between 15 and 20% of guys say they've done that. If you look at guys who do it year after year after year, we're down to about 5% of guys. So not very many. That's about 1 in 20. So kind of a surprising number.
Right. Are you saying like 3 partners a year for, let's use an example of 3 consecutive years. So a dude who has 9 partners over the course of 3 years, that's only 5% of the population?
If he's doing it at least 3 partners a year, yes, we're talking about 5% of the population, 1 guy in 20.
That's pretty low. And Dr. Plante, you've done a lot of research on the so-called hookup culture. Let's tell parents really what the truth is about the hookup culture, statistically.
Well, statistically, one of the most interesting things that comes up is that about 20% of college students will say when they graduate that they are a virgin. And that statistic will surprise some parents. It certainly surprises other college students whenever I give talks about this and I explain that, you know, I mean, the flip side of it is, oh, wow, so 80% of college students leave college and would not call themselves virgins. But to hear that 20% do is sort of surprising. And the thing about hooking up is, so 20% are virgins, but that doesn't mean they haven't hooked up. It just means that they haven't necessarily had intercourse, penile-vaginal intercourse, and it may mean that they haven't hooked up or haven't hooked up much. So one of the most surprising things, I think, for parents is to consider really how broad and vague and complicated and fuzzy the term hooking up actually is. And it's important to remember that the conversations about sex are also sort of broad and vague and fuzzy and complicated. So it's not really surprising that hooking up is understood and practiced kind of similarly.
And we also, go ahead, Laura.
Okay, thank you. I actually have a question about why that came about. If these are the real statistics, why are we taught that everyone in our culture is having sex, that men are only motivated by sex, that they're having sex with everyone they can get their hands on? How did that come about in our culture?
Well, let me start about who's probably spreading the rumors. There is a segment of our population who prefers to have short-term relationships, and that's just, the nature of our species. Not everybody is wired to be monogamous, of course, and not everybody is wired to have long-term relationships that involve a deep emotional attachment. Surprisingly, about 50% of humans are, though. However, the people who want to have regular short-term relationships need to spread the news around the population that sex is free and cheap and easy and mostly no strings attached. Would you agree with me, Dr. Smiler, or what else can you add to that?
That is certainly a practical strategy. If you want people to be hooking up or having short-term sexual relationships, you need to get the word out there. I tracked a little bit of the history of this in my book, Challenging Casanova. If you look at TV shows prior to about 1970, you can't find a male lead or a female lead who is promiscuous, and at least not in a major popular show. There's 1 or 2 shows prior to that, but they don't last more than a season or 2.
And then came the Fonz.
And then we get the Fonz and we get Hawkeye Pierce, who are very much speaking to different audiences. Hawkeye Pierce, as far as I can tell, slept with every nurse in Korea. And Fonz slept with every woman in Milwaukee, except for Mrs. Cunningham.
Of course, not Mrs. Cunningham.
Right, but these characters really start this new thing. We know that TV writers copy each other, and we now have this 40-year history of TV shows, mostly sitcoms, with a male lead who is promiscuous and cool, and he really is the star of the show. My favorite bad example is Charlie Sheen's character, Charlie, on 2.5 Men.
Oh, wow.
He's rich, he gets any woman he wants, and he gets all the good lines. If you listen to the show and you just listen for the laugh track, Charlie's always got the good lines. Alan, who is a nice guy, who is probably the guy you'd want to settle down with, never gets a good line, and he's at the butt of every joke. But
the other thing I've noticed, speaking of media images of men, is we've sort of lost the strong father role model, or even just the responsible father role model. The fathers in our sitcoms, starting with Married with Children back in the 80s, have become these kinds of losers. For boys to look up to now, really the player is the only thing that's left.
Yeah, and that's certainly out there. We see that in a lot of music videos as well, particularly rap videos, pushing that image. I think we are starting to get some better fathers back. The Middle and Modern Family has some good guys that we might really start to look up to and hope that our kids follow in their steps and not be Al Bundy or Tim Taylor from Home Improvement.
So, Dr. Plante, moving back to the conversation of sexual education in boys, the big question parents always ask me is, what age do you start having the conversation, and what really do you tell them at the beginning?
Well, ideally, parents and caregivers will start having that conversation, 4 years old, 5 years old. And the conversation obviously needs to be age appropriate. It should be different for a younger child, and it should be considerate of where the child is developmentally. But that conversation needs to start in terms of making it clear that that we have bodies, that we have body parts, being careful about the kinds of names we use for those body parts, being careful about how we respond, because inevitably younger children will begin some exploration of their bodies. It may or may not be sexual. It's really hard to tell because we have an adult overlay where we may look at behavior and say, oh, that's sexual, and get sort of horrified. And the child is really just experimenting and trying to understand the sensations in his body. And it may or may not be sexual, but that's really the right time, is to start to normalize and to make clear that there's a space for honesty and for openness and for clarity. And each parent needs to figure out what that space is going to include, and then how that space will be expanded as the child goes through life. And that way it's not like, oh, suddenly there's this 15-year-old who's sort of like smells like a man and maybe has chest hair and facial hair like a man, but cognitively and developmentally is not a man. Now I have to go talk to this man who's living in the upstairs bedroom masquerading as my son and try to tell him something that the scene that comes to mind, as long as we're trading old pop culture references, the scene that always comes to mind for me is American Pie, that great scene with Eugene Levy, where he goes in and sits with his son, and he's like, opens up this porn magazines and sort of like, now this is a naked adult woman, and and his son is completely horrified because they've never had this conversation before.
Way too late. I think you're right that the big message, if you start early, and I think the time to start is when they start asking questions, as kids will do, but the big message is that you are now the source of information, that therefore they don't have to go to the street or their peers or the internet. If you start from the beginning answering in simple, child-appropriate ways. I mean, I only have girls, but when I became pregnant with my second, I had a 4-year-old, and she asked how the baby got in there. So I ran to the director of our preschool saying, I don't know, my mother told me that God put it in there. What do I tell my kid? And she said, here's a lovely book with beautiful illustrations that shows the whole sex act and how it all works. And so I read her that book, and she got it. And then a few weeks later, we were I think she was like 5, because I know I had the baby with me, and she was having a little tennis lesson, and she said to her male tennis coach, as she looked at the racket that had a Wilson logo, she said, look, doesn't that look exactly like fallopian tubes? And, this 20-something tennis instructor just about fainted. He didn't know what to say. But I think using proper anatomically correct language for body parts is really, really important, especially for young children, and using them in a non-pejorative or non-emotional or embarrassing way, so that, this is your elbow, this is your knee, this is your vulva, this is your penis, this is your scrotum. It's just like, these are just words, so they understand they're just words for body parts without a lot of giggle and snicker and silly names for things, because then it sends the message that there's something wrong or embarrassing about this. Do you agree with me, Dr. Smiler?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a great story, Dr. Wendy. And I like your point about, part of the message here is that you are the authority. There are other pieces in there about, some of these early conversations really just set the stage for what you're going to talk about later. And as Dr. Plante was saying, It needs to be age appropriate. It needs to be developmentally appropriate, depending on how mature your child is. So, when the kids are younger, we might talk to them about, these people are a couple, or whether that's married or dating or whatever. And then, by the time kids are 10 and maybe into first crushes, we might revisit this notion of what is a couple in a little more detail. And then again at 14 or 16, when they that light goes on, and oh my God, there's these people that we're really attracted to now, and we can build on those conversations instead of just having Eugene Levy come and sit down with his Playboy there.
So, if you can explain to me what kind of really specific, concrete ways that parents can talk about what a couple is and what a couple feels like. I love that you've led with, well, ask boys about their feelings with certain girls and what their experiences are like, and get them talking and give them an emotional vocabulary. That's a good start. But if you're also trying to explain to them this idea of love and a sexual relationship, what would you say?
And that's a great question. There are a lot of ways to come at that. One of the things that I encourage parents to do, and I use this in therapy with boys as well, is we talk about different types of relationships. Most boys have a very close friend, someone that they consider like a brother, someone they will often talk about as someone they love or someone who is very important to them. But that's and they're very clear that that is a friendship, that is not about some kind of same-sex attraction or whatever. And they can distinguish that from how they feel towards a sibling, how they feel towards parent. If they have some experience dating, they can distinguish it against that as well. I might also contrast what it's like to be on a team and talking to your coach, or what it's like to be a student talking to a teacher, because boys do have all of these different types of relationships. But in general, we don't tend to talk to boys about how relationships work and what it feels like to be in a relationship, what it feels like when somebody has your back or somebody violates that trust. But we can start with those relationships they do have, and then kind of expand them over into the dating kinds of relationships, because it's a lot of the same stuff, a lot of the same material, although it shows up differently for different types of relationships.
One of the readers of my newsletter sent me an email today, a very tragic email. He's probably tuned in now, seeing the show. And he asked me, obviously he's very sad and upset because he just found out that his college-age son had actually been raped when he was 8 years old by the friend of a babysitter, male. So what can we tell kids to help them understand sexual boundaries and that it's okay to talk about these things to their parents?
You want to take that, Dr. Plante, or you want me to take that?
Dr. Plante. I'll give you a hard one, Dr. Plante.
Yeah, I was hoping you would take it.
All right, I'll take that. When we're talking to kids about good touch and bad touch, sexual assault, rape, whatever we're going to call bad touch, we need to be very clear that the old kind of stranger danger model that a lot of us grew up with, where the bad guy jumps out from the corner of the building and attacks you, is actually a small minority of the cases. That date rape, sexual assault, even kind of full-on rape are much more likely, and in the majority of cases, happen in a case where the perpetrator is known to the victim. These are not complete strangers. So we need to mentally redraw our boundaries there. We need to instill in our kids a sense that their body is their own to control, that other people shouldn't be touching them in ways that they don't want or they don't like, and that even though it may happen, and we certainly know that it happens much more often than we'd like it to happen, that they can come to us and tell us. We know that, especially for younger kids getting raped, the perpetrators are almost always adults, and they often threaten the kids and tell the kids that if the kids tell, then something bad will happen to their parents. And that's a really hard one to work around in many cases, but it's important that we periodically remind our kids that they can tell us anything, and even though we might not like it, we are there to support them.
And that it's never, ever, ever their fault. I think
Yes.
that's really important.
Dr. Wendy,
Go ahead.
we do have another question coming in. Is it ever inappropriate to talk about sex with your boy? And I guess we should take the case of an adolescent teenager. Can you mess it up? Is there something that you can say that will traumatize them forever? I feel like a lot of parents that I know are maybe actually afraid of talking to their kids about this because they're afraid that they're going to say something wrong that will mess up their sexuality.
Right, too much information too soon. Dr. Plante, what would you say about that? Where would the boundary be for an inappropriate conversation with a boy?
Well, I think that an inappropriate conversation is unfortunately the one that most people are afraid of having, which is the one where the parent, having grown up in this culture that is fairly sex negative and doesn't give good models for this kind of thing. So the most negative conversation is the one where the parent goes to sit down and stumbles and is awkward and gives incorrect information, and through their body language, through their nonverbals, through their verbal communication, makes it clear to their child that they're really uncomfortable with this. And so I think that's the kind of conversation that most parents really fear having, is the one that makes it clear, like, hey, kiddo, I'm in over my head here too. On the other hand, what it seems like we hear consistently when we talk to young men who become adult men and we ask them about these kinds of things, one thing we hear most consistently is the worst kind of conversation, and the way to mess it up the most is to never ever have the conversation in the first place, to never acknowledge that that this is part of the shepherding that caregivers do for their children, which is the very important stuff that Dr. Smiler was talking about. People need to understand our bodies are ours, and what our good boundaries are, and what the boundaries are that we want to share with other people, and that's part of the healthy sexuality that we hope we can gift our children with. And so we have to have the conversations.
I think that's a really good point, to just make sure you have the conversation and make it in a sex-positive conversation without being a highly sexualized conversation, meaning that you want to tell the child or the adolescent or the young man that their body is their body and they're going to make their choices. You love them as a parent, and you're hoping that they'll make choices where they won't be harmed physically or emotionally. So you'll provide them with whatever information you can from your own experience, without doing the, isn't she hot, babe, oh, let's check out this one, right? I think that sometimes when a father tries to have a conversation with his son about sex, Dr. Smiler, he doesn't have the tools to talk about the emotional pieces of love and commitment even. And so it becomes a sort of a frat house conversation about women and plumbing. Is that true? Do you get that?
Yeah, I hear a lot of that. We see some of that in research as well. And I'll second what Dr. Plante said and what you said. A lot of this needs to be about honesty. It needs to come from the parents honestly. It needs to be about relationship. Talk about the importance of connection, or the importance of not being connected, as the case may be. One of the things that I often have to prompt parents about, and they're often surprised to hear, is that parents don't actually need to talk about the plumbing and the mechanics a whole lot.
No. That's all over the internet for free.
Right. That is, porn is not good for a lot of things when it comes to teenagers, but we know that about a third of 14-year-old American boys are watching porn with some regularity. They're going to learn that, what goes where. What they need from parents is a way to make decisions and a value system that gives them guidance, that helps them decide what's likely to be pleasurable, what they're likely to enjoy, what they're likely to regret and therefore can avoid. And that's where the big focus of the conversation needs to be. And coming back to some things that you often say, Dr. Wendy, it needs to be honest, it needs to be based in your values, your personal beliefs, some of that relationship stuff.
You brought up porn, or maybe I threw it in there, so I think we have to go now. And I do want to hear, Dr. Smiler, from your well-researched opinion first, and also because you have a voice with more testosterone. What are the reasons why porn are bad for teenage boys again?
There are a couple of reasons. Part of this is about the kind of indirect messages that teenagers learn from porn. Porn is really made by adults for adults. And we know that kids watch it the same way that we know that kids smoke cigarettes and drink alcohol, which are also products by adults for adults. Excuse me, one of my lights just went off. One of the messages that porn sends is that relationships are strictly optional. And then in most porn, we also see a real disregard for women. They really do just become objects to be used by the men. And in some of the more extreme stuff, there's real violence towards women, real degradation of women. So that's kind of the embedded values. We also know, and I work with some boys and young men who are watching way too much porn and masturbating while they do it. And if you think about sex, just like any other physical behavior where you can train yourself to respond to certain stimuli in certain ways, if you're used to achieving orgasm by watching porn and enjoying your own company, then all of a sudden when you're with a partner and it works differently because there's someone else there and because the action is not just about your what's happening visually, but what's happening with your other four senses as well, all of a sudden it may not go as you'd like it to go. And so that becomes a problem as well. People kind of train their bodies to respond to different things.
That's right. In my book, The 30-Day Love Detox, where I think I quote you as well, Dr. Smiler, I talk about how sex therapists are seeing that the darling diagnosis these days is DE, delayed ejaculation. In other words, they can become aroused with touch, but they can't actually climax without a new visual stimuli because they're used to so much new visual stimuli from consuming so much porn. So it's becoming a problem in a lot of relationships, adult relationships as well. Dr. Plante, what can you add to the porn argument, or what can parents tell their boys about porn? I mean, we can't monitor their time online 100% of their time. What can we tell them?
Well, I think, again, an honest conversation has to happen, and part of that conversation is that, in fact, the research on pornography is so up in the air. There was a huge set of studies just recently released that suggest, unfortunately, that the jury's really out on the long-term effects of pornography on young adults. So some studies, these are cross-cultural studies, some will say, oh, you know, it's really, there's this delicate balance, and it can mess with the balance of sexual and emotional development. And then other studies that say it doesn't seem to have any long-lasting or significant effects besides helping someone to get off. And so where the jury is out, I think that that one of the things to do is to be open and to not treat pornography like it is this sort of taboo thing that exists in the dark.
Because that'll make it more exciting. The world's
Right.
aphrodisiac is the word no.
Yeah, there's sort of dark regions like, oh, I can sneak this on the internet when my parents aren't around to get on my back about it. And it might be interesting, I mean, again, maybe this is sort of just like out of a movie to imagine this, but imagine having a conversation with your son to say, so, you know, what are you drawn to? What are you looking at? What are you watching? A lot of young men really know the difference between what they see on a screen and what they experience with other people, and it's worthwhile to have that kind of conversation.
You know, I have to tell my two fabulous guests that this is the fastest 30 minutes I've ever had on a Google Hangout. Your information is so compelling, and I could sit here for the next 3 hours and talk to both of you. Carrington, I can see you crawling in the back of my shot. That's my teenager, by the way.
Hi.
Wave, honey, since you're on.
Hi, stand up.
So I want to encourage anyone who's watching to get the books by these amazing researchers. Dr. Rebecca Plante, her book is called Sexualities in Context. Dr. Andrew Smiler. His book is called Challenging Casanova, and there's a lot of good stuff for women and girls in my book, The 30-Day Love Detox. We will see you next week for Wine with Dr. Wendy. Laura Hampikian, thanks for joining us, and all of you, we'll see you next Wednesday.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.